Hey everyone, welcome back. We got so many requests to do a deep dive into the Supreme Court's role in American democracy.
Yeah, this is a big one.
It is. And well, we found a really thought-provoking piece to help us get into it. It's called The Roberts Court: Undoing Democracy by Judicial Fiat.
Ooh, that title doesn't pull any punches.
It really doesn't. The
Hmm.
author, Michael Podhorzer, argues that basically the Roberts Court isn't upholding democracy. He says it's actually actively undermining it.
Wow.
Yeah, he even calls it a constitutional coup. So
Hmm.
right off the bat, I'm curious, what do you think about that? Constitutional coup, does that feel a little, I don't know, a little extreme? Or is he onto something?
I mean, it's definitely strong language. It makes you stop and think. Is this just like provocative rhetoric, or is there something, deeper here? And that's what we're going to dig into.
Exactly. So let's start unpacking this whole constitutional coup idea. Podhorzer makes this really interesting distinction between a constitutional crisis, which we hear about a lot, and a coup. So a crisis, he says, is more like a sudden event, right? Something unexpected, whereas a coup is more this like deliberate takeover that happens over time, kind of like slowly but surely.
Hmm.
And he points to some pretty specific examples to support this idea. He talks about how the Roberts Court basically shielded Trump from accountability in cases like, Trump v. U.S. and Trump v. Anderson. And he talks about how Citizens United basically opened the floodgates for, unlimited political spending by like billionaires, folks like Elon Musk.
Yeah, those are some pretty big examples for sure. And it really makes you think about the lasting impact, of some of these court decisions. Like, think about it, right? Someone like Elon Musk, I mean, with practically unlimited resources, can just pour money into campaigns and try to influence policy.
Yeah, it's wild. It makes you wonder, like, is this really what the framers of the Constitution had in mind? You know what I mean?
Right, right.
So to dig into this even more, Podhorzer gets into this fascinating conflict between what he calls judicial supremacy and popular constitutionalism.
Yeah.
And I think these are really important ideas for us to get our heads around. So can you kind of break those down for us, like in a way that, everyone can understand?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, think of it like this. Imagine the Constitution as kind of a living document, right? It's not this fixed, unchanging thing. It's constantly being interpreted and reinterpreted.
Right.
So judicial supremacy basically says that the Supreme Court has, like, the ultimate authority, the final say on what the Constitution means,
Sure.
regardless of what the people or their elected representatives think. So it's kind of like the court's word is law, end of story.
Got it.
But then you have popular constitutionalism, which is a completely different view. It argues that interpreting the Constitution should be this ongoing, like, democratic process. And
Right.
it involves everyone, right? Legislatures, presidents, and most importantly, the people themselves.
So it's not just about like legal scholars debating in their ivory towers.
Exactly. Think about, historical movements like the abolitionists, the labor movement, the civil rights movement. These movements, they all challenged the kind of, prevailing interpretations of the Constitution. They were pushing for a more just and inclusive understanding of what it means. And they were doing that, like, outside the courtroom. They were organizing, they were protesting, they were engaging in popular constitutionalism.
Right.
They were working to shape the meaning of the Constitution.
That's such a good point. It makes you realize that, like, we the people, like,
Right.
we actually have a role to play in this. We're not just passive bystanders. We can shape how the Constitution is understood and how it's
Yeah.
applied.
Yeah, for sure.
But this whole pattern that Podhorzer is talking about with the Roberts Court, this idea that they're kind of favoring certain outcomes, it raises this really big question, which is like, who really benefits from this, from this concentration of power?
Yeah.
And to get at that, he uses this term, rule by fiat. It's kind of a mouthful. Can you explain what he means by that? Because he's basically saying that some judges are prioritizing achieving specific results, like they're more focused on the outcome that they want, and they're kind of maybe not so strictly adhering to the like legal principles or the process.
Right.
And he specifically points to the influence of the Federalist Society in shaping the current court, like kind of pushing this idea. So can you unpack rule by fiat for us a little bit?
Yeah, so it's really important to understand the difference between what he calls rule by fiat and then, like, this rule of law system. So under rule of law, judges are supposed to, like, apply constitutional principles consistently.
Right.
They're supposed to do it in good faith, like regardless of their personal opinions or, political leanings.
Right.
But with rule by fiat, it's more about like, achieving a specific agenda, even if it means kind of like bending the rules or interpreting things, in a way that might not be like totally consistent with, past precedent or, the original intent. And Podhorzer points out that this distinction becomes really clear when you look at how Trump fared in different courts.
That's so interesting. It's like in the lower courts where presumably, rule of law was still more in play, he consistently lost, right? Like all those legal battles, he kept losing.
Right.
But then when those cases got to the Roberts Court, the outcome was often like completely different.
Exactly. And Podhorzer specifically calls out judges like Aileen Cannon and Matthew Kaczmarek as kind of like examples of this, like, what he calls shameless application of rule by fiat. But then on the other hand, he mentions people like Brad Raffensperger and then, those dissenting SDNY attorneys as examples of people who are kind of like maybe representing a more nuanced approach within the Federalist Society.
So it's not like everybody in the Federalist Society is like, yeah, rule by fiat all the way.
Right.
There's a spectrum there.
Right. It's important to remember, it's not like this monolithic block. There are these, internal debates and varying levels of kind of like commitment to these ideas. It's not so black and white.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think Podhorzer is being too alarmist, like in his assessment of this whole shift toward judicial supremacy? Or is this like a legitimate concern?
I mean, it's tough to say, right? I think reasonable people can disagree on like the extent of the influence and like the long-term consequences of all this. But I think the important thing is that, Podhorzer's work is raising these really important questions about the balance of power in our democracy.
Yeah.
Like who has the power and like what are they doing with it? And I think those questions are worth, thinking about. They're worth exploring further.
Totally. And that's what we're here to do.
Exactly.
So let's keep going.
All right.
I don't know about you, but it's kind of unnerving, right? Like to think about how much influence these unelected judges have over our lives, the stakes feel so high.
Definitely.
Yeah. But what I appreciate about Podhorzer is he doesn't just like point out the problem and leave us hanging.
Right.
He actually offers some solutions.
Yeah.
He talks about this idea of restoring popular constitutionalism. He's saying, like, we need to recognize and speak out against what he sees as the Roberts Court's, like, undemocratic practices.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm kind of like, okay, where do we even begin with that? It all feels a little overwhelming. Like, how do we actually, like, push back against this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's understandable to feel that way, right? It's a huge system. But Podhorzer has some practical steps that we can take. And some of them are honestly, like, surprisingly simple. Like, one of the things he suggests is that we stop saying the Supreme Court and start calling it the Roberts Court.
Oh, interesting. Why does that matter? Like, what difference does that make?
Well, think about it, right? When we say the Roberts Court instead of just, the Supreme Court, it kind of, like, personalizes it a bit. Like, we're acknowledging that these aren't just, like, these abstract decisions handed down from, like, this faceless institution. These are choices made by like real people.
Right, with names.
Yeah, exactly. People with like, their own beliefs and their own agendas. So it's kind of about like assigning responsibility, right? It's about holding individuals accountable for the impact of their decisions.
I see. So it's kind of like, taking it from this like, untouchable entity to like, no, these are the people who are like shaping the course of our, democracy.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like that.
And then another important point that Podhorzer makes is this idea of like distinguishing between what's legal and what's legitimate.
Oh, okay.
Because we often just assume that if the court rules on something, it must be both, right? It must be legal and it must be legitimate. But Podhorzer is saying, like, hold on a second, like, we need to question that assumption.
So you're saying, like, just because something's technically legal doesn't necessarily mean that it's, like, morally right or that it's in line with, like, the principles of a democratic society.
Exactly. And he also warns us not to fall into this trap of, like, praising Roberts for those occasional, quote-unquote, right decisions.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Because those, like, seemingly positive decisions might actually just be, like, strategic moves within, like, a larger, maybe less savory agenda.
Yeah.
It's like playing chess. You're like thinking several moves ahead.
Exactly. It's about, seeing the forest for the trees. Like, don't be fooled by these, like, isolated instances that might seem like the court is acting in like the best interests of the people. We need to look at the bigger picture and the long-term consequences.
Yeah, okay. I get that. So basically, we need to be a lot more like critical and discerning in how we view the court's decisions.
Hmm.
Like, don't just take them at face value. But what else can we do? Like, we're being more critical. We're calling it the Roberts Court. But like, what else can we do to actually push back against this whole rule by fiat system and like actually reclaim our power as, citizens in a democracy?
Yeah, that's the big question. Podhorzer, he talks about how it's really important to connect these Supreme Court cases to their real world
Oh,
consequences. Like we need to go beyond just the like abstract legal doctrines and show people like how these decisions actually like directly impact their lives.
so it's like take Citizens United, for example.
Yeah.
It's not just some abstract case about campaign finance. It's about, the fact that billionaires like Elon Musk now have like this huge influence over our elections. Like they can just pour money into campaigns and try to sway the outcome.
Exactly. And we need to talk about these cases in a way that like makes sense to ordinary people,
Right.
not just lawyers and legal scholars. Like
Yeah.
connect the dots between these rulings and issues that people actually care about,
Right.
like healthcare, climate change, economic inequality. Like make it clear how these seemingly like, distant court decisions are actually shaping the world that we live in.
Yeah. Okay. And then Podhorzer also talks about this idea of like naming names, which I thought was interesting. What does he mean by that?
Yeah, so he's basically saying like, we need to be specific about who's actually benefiting from these court decisions. Like, don't just talk about, like these vague corporate interests or like shadowy elites.
Right.
Like, actually, focus on the individuals and the groups who are actually gaining power and influence as a result of these rulings.
So like instead of just saying, corporate interests benefited from this ruling, we could actually name like the specific companies or industries that like lobbied for it.
Exactly. Like, make it personal. Show people how these decisions are impacting their lives, their communities, their futures. Like, by putting a face on these issues, we can make them more relatable and understandable for everyday people.
Yeah, it's kind of like pulling back the curtain, right?
Yeah.
Like exposing the like mechanics of power, like showing people how the system works, who benefits, and how they can get involved in pushing for change.
Exactly. It's about empowering people to reclaim their role in shaping the meaning of the Constitution. Like, we can't just leave it to, these 9 unelected judges to decide the fate of our democracy.
Well said. Wow. Okay, so this is a lot to process. I mean, Podhorzer calls this a constitutional coup, and it's it's hard to argue with that when you see how much power has shifted to the court. But I guess what I keep coming back to is like if the system is rigged like this, like what can we actually do about it? Like is there any hope?
Yeah, I think that's the question a lot of people are wrestling with. And it's easy to feel that sense of frustration and even like despair. Like, the system's broken and there's nothing we can do.
Right.
But I think what Podhurst is trying to do is like remind us of our own history.
Right.
Like he wants us to look back at those movements, the social movements that fought for justice and expanded our like understanding of what the Constitution could be. Like they didn't just wait for the courts to like hand down favorable rulings.
Right, like the movements for abolition, labor rights, civil rights.
Exactly. They organized, they protested, they shifted public opinion, and they forced, those in power to listen. They understood that change doesn't just happen in the courtrooms. It happens when people come together and they demand it.
So it's about recognizing that we actually have agency. Like we can make a difference, even if it feels like the odds are stacked against us.
I think that's a huge part of it. And it starts with like education, right? It starts with understanding the issues at stake and how they impact our lives. Like this is why, deep dives like this are so important. Like we need to be having these conversations, we need to be sharing this information, and we need to be like figuring out how to move forward together.
Like that old saying, knowledge is power. Like the more we understand about, how the system actually works, the better equipped we are to to challenge it and to push for change.
Totally. It's not about just like blind faith in institutions, right? It's about like informed engagement. It's about demanding a system that actually like reflects, the values of justice and equality.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, like what's the one thing you want our listener to kind of walk away with today?
I want them to ask themselves, it's a simple question, but it's a really profound one, I think. What does justice truly mean in a system where the highest court seems to be serving the interests of just a select few?
That's a really powerful question, and it's one that we all need to be, grappling with.
Yeah, and there are no easy answers, but I think asking the tough questions is the first step. Like do your research, explore resources. There are some amazing ones out there, like the Law and Political Economy Project is one, but most importantly, like don't be afraid to demand more from our institutions.
Yeah. Well, this has been a really thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much for helping us unpack all of this.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the role of the Roberts Court. We hope you found it informative, we hope you found it empowering, and we hope that you'll continue to learn, to question, and to push for a more just and more democratic society.